Hello, everybody, and welcome to the August edition of the Data Architecture Virtual Group. My name is Kenny Neal, and I am the co-leader along with my partner, Rob Canzonire. This month, we are thrilled to have Constantine here to talk to us about DBA tools. I can get my slideshow to work with me here. Next month, we're going to have Jamie Johnson talking about R. Please join us for that. You can follow our website, dataarch.pass.org. You can also follow us on Twitter at PassDAVC, and that's where you'll find information and reminders about our upcoming meetings. We are sponsored once again by Nutanix. This is their second year sponsoring us. We're really thankful to have them as a sponsor again, and it's because of their sponsorship that we are going to be able to give away $100 to an attendee at the end of this meeting. So please check them out at the URL at the bottom of the screen and thank them for sponsoring us and helping make this possible. Coming up at the end of October this year is going to be the PASS Summit in Seattle. It's a great event. If you can make it over there, we've got a discount code there at the bottom of the screen. You can use that to get $150 off. And here are some upcoming virtual chapter webinars. Business administration, database administration. We are just one of many other virtual groups. You can find something about any topic you can think of, or even in a foreign language if you don't speak English. And here are some upcoming SQL Saturdays. This weekend, we've got Jacksonville and Indianapolis and Sri Lanka, all within driving distance. And so that's enough for me. Go ahead and change it over to Constantine now. And here we go.
Awesome. So 1 second, I'm just going to share the correct screen with y'all, and then we will get started. Excellent. All right, hopefully everything's coming through correctly. And I'm just gonna head off from here. So I'm here to present Introduction to DBA Tools, and when I say I'm talking about me, Constantine Kokkinos. I'm a DBA at Aviante Software. You can find me on Twitter at MobileCK, and I've spent a couple of years banging around the tech world. I used to be an Apple certified trainer, and right now I spend a lot of my time working as a DBA Tools major contributor, which we'll get into a little bit more, and actually used to be something very unique, and thankfully we are getting more and more as time's going on. So eventually that will just be a very normal thing. In our project, I spend most of my time working on Git problems. That's really the source control stuff, any merge conflicts, etc. Working on weird bugs, and helping newbies actually get involved with the project. And that's really why I'm talking to you today. Is not only am I going to kind of demonstrate some of the DBA tools, things you can do, and kind of what is it, how it works, but I also want you to become one of us, frankly. I want you to understand a little bit about the project, see the value in it, and maybe come contribute. So before I dive kind of headfirst into all of that stuff, I want to just quickly talk about the overview, what I'm going to be talking about today. So pretty straightforward. What is DBA Tools? You know, we're going to talk a little bit more about what the project actually is, and then we're going to get into how does it work? You know, questions I get from a lot of newbies, especially people who know SQL and are really great with SQL Server, but maybe not PowerShell experts. And, you know, in DBA Tools, we have all kinds. We've got sysadmins, we've got DBAs, we've got people who frankly do none of those things that are into C# programming. We've got people who focus on testing. So really all of these disparate places need to come together so we can understand what we're actually working on. And then we'll kind of be more into the pragmatic realm. Will it work on my machine? How do I get DBA tools? How do I use it? And then this is more for the newbies. So I want to really focus a bit on how to get help. If you're stuck, if you have a problem, I want to tell you how you can actually solve that problem, or at the very least, get useful error messages, get useful information so that you can come either to our Slack channel or to GitHub with us, file an issue, and we can work and solve your problem. And then the end of that, we've got a nice little demo. I'm going to show off some stuff I do every day with DBA Tools and some things that I basically use on, say, a server that's coming into my domain and that I didn't necessarily set up, and kind of checking on the terrible, evil things that maybe someone else accidentally did. Awesome. All right, so let's start with what is DBA Tools. So DBA Tools is an open source PowerShell module that targets SQL Server. So if you've ever been to dbatools.io, you would see this lovely, beautiful face. And to be honest, that's the same thing I saw 1 year ago when I started contributing to DBA Tools, simply really by being a cheerleader. I was like, holy crap, this looks awesome. And you might not be able to read it very well, but it says instant migrations and best practice implementations have never been safer, faster, or freer. Mostly because you can't get freer than free. But DBA Tools really started focusing on SQL migrations. Chrissy Lemaire, the head of the project, really invented it to do that and spent a ton of time before DBA Tools ever became a publicly known thing on the migration aspects. And when I started contributing, there was probably less than 4 or 5 contributors, and really DBA Tools was expanding. And so that was the starting point of DBA Tools. The reality is today, DBA Tools is a huge community of people. You can see in our Slack channel, we have 831 members currently, a lot of lurkers, but actually a lot of contributors. And we're all working on a centralized GitHub repository under the SQL Collaborative. That you can see in the top left-hand corner if you're familiar with the GitHub interface. If not, don't worry, we'll talk a little bit about that later. But the SQL Collaborative is actually the community project of the people working on DBA Tools. There are also other projects we're working on that, some are a little bit stagnant at this point, some are actively in development. And most of our community presentations, for instance, are found under the SQL Collaborative box. So if you want to contribute to DBA Tools, you probably want to show up in our Slack channel. You can actually see the short URL to the Slack channel underneath there, dbatools.io/Slack. And that's the primary method of communication. We're an international group. I believe Kenny or Rob asked me, oh, are you in the UK? Because a lot of DBA Tools people are there. Rob's there. Or I could be in Germany. I could be in Italy. I could be in Portugal. I'm in the United States. But DBA Tools, really, no matter what time of the day you jump in and need a question answered or need some help, there's going to be someone at the very least seeing what you're saying, and sometimes can even help. All right, so we have this idea of here's the newer DBA Tools. I want to talk about how DBA Tools works. And I want you to understand a little bit more about the underlying technologies for DBA Tools, because a lot of newbies who've come to me and started working through the project have really been confused, and it's simpler than most realize. So like I said, DBA Tools is a PowerShell module that targets SQL Server. And we'll talk about how to get PowerShell modules and that kind of fun stuff later. But fundamentally, we actually live on top of the shoulders of really powerful stuff. So the first main technology that we use in DBA Tools, and we use from PowerShell, is called SMO, or Server Management Objects. And that is a C# library for interacting with SQL Server. And really, it's the library that SSMS uses to connect and communicate with SQL Server. So hopefully most of us have launched SSMS recently, and maybe use some GUI interactions, maybe change some settings. Fundamentally, that abstraction, that SMO library, allows the authors of SSMS to do a lot of stuff without writing a bunch of specific SQL code. And it even manages different versions, all sorts of different problems for us. So we can write fairly simple code and take advantage of SMO in a great way. So the only downside, and sometimes we will switch back to pure SQL, is when SMO itself is a little too slow. Really, it's not so much SMO is bad, it's generic. And as we know, if you do SQL, generic can be slow in some cases. So that's one of the main components. The other really is WMI or CIM. And getting into acronym town a little bit, but Windows Management Instrumentation, or the Common Information Model, which there's not a test at the end, so don't worry about remembering that, are basically implementations of the same thing. WMI is the Windows version of CIM, and these are basically the server level components, where we're leaving SQL Server behind and we're just going and connecting to your server and saying, hey, how much space is in your hard drives? What's your CPU look like? You know, things that technically you can now get from SQL Server, or you can do some tricks to get. We do it in this more native fashion because it's usually much faster, to be honest. And so this really covers the server stuff. So when you put it all together, what you actually see is PowerShell, DBA Tools, calling SMO, which often boils down to just pure SQL queries, so a SQL client, mixed with the Windows management instrumentation or computer information combined. And this process allows us to make better decisions and make decisions more easily than I have seen any other solution able to do. When I use DBA tools, it's just really, really easy to do things that frankly I would have a couple thousand lines of SQL code to do. And while those SQL codes work fine, I really got sick of maintaining, oh, this version has this feature, this version has this feature. SMO mostly takes care of that for you. And so I can just run a one-line command that used to be 1,000 lines of code, and if I need to fix something or change something, I really get all of these benefits of all of this other technology instead of just starting from scratch and basically doing string munging the entire time. So that's kind of the basics of how DBA Tools works. It's less complicated than you think, and fundamentally you can trace it. DBA Tools properly announces itself in its connection string, and you can even, if you have monitoring software, say, oh, that's when I did the thing with DBA Tools. So it's a lovely little package, and let's talk about system requirements and how to get DBA Tools. Awesome. So one of the big questions is, am I sure this is going to work on my system? And how do I need to install DBA tools to make it work for my environment? So important things in system requirements land are the minimum requirements. These are not recommended. These are what you have to have. And that really looks like PowerShell version 3, SSMS or SMO 2008 or 2, because SSMS will install SMO. This is actually changing now. DBA Tools is starting to package the SMO libraries. Thankfully, after talking to Microsoft, Chrissy Lemaire, I don't know how she got that magic done, but fundamentally it means that we can ship you the whole package. You don't even need to install SSMS anymore, or what we're now going to be the client libraries. You can just install DBA Tools and be happy. Windows 7 Plus, mainly because PowerShell v3 is Windows 7. So it's just an easy way to call that out. If you're running an older operating system than Windows 7, remember that Windows 7 came out in 2009. It is 2017. So it is time to move on. And then that's all on the client. Most of the time, you're going to install DBA tools on your workstation or your jump server, and then all the commands you issue can actually just connect to those servers and run. You don't have to install DBA tools on your SQL server. But if you want all of the commands to run flawlessly, you're going to need to have at least PowerShell version 2 on your Windows commands. And we do actually support SQL Server 2000. So if you do a pure SQL command, like a restore database or backup database command, that will absolutely work on 2000. If it doesn't, let me know, I will fix it. And that's also a part of the whole PowerShell remoting. There are some cases where it basically needs to invoke the command in a certain context that can't really be done without PowerShell v 2.0. So pretty basic on the minimum. If you have anything greater than that, you're gonna have a much better time. And that's our recommended settings. Right now, you can download PowerShell v5.1, and I think 6.0 is being released momentarily if it's not already in beta. You definitely want PowerShell 5.1 if you don't already have it and you have any idea that you want to regularly use PowerShell. There's some significant performance improvements. There's also a bunch of security improvements that I won't go into, but around logging what's happening and seeing if anything is going untoward with your PowerShell. And of course, a bunch of additional features, which we will talk about one of them in a second. And SQL Server 2008 R2, mainly because that's the last version supported by Microsoft effectively, but also because that's the version of SQL Server where you really start seeing the dynamic management views and the features kind of match in many ways with some of the more modern versions. SQL 2000 is a very different beast than SQL 2008 or 2 or even 2005. So yeah, definitely upgrade your SQL servers if you can. All right, so system requirements done kind of quickly, but I figure that's like the most boring thing. So let's talk about installing DBA tools. And this is something that Chrissy Lemaire has spent a lot of time trying to make as easy as possible. And to be honest, the package maintainers for the PowerShell gallery have spent a ton of time making installing PowerShell modules super easy. So how do I get it? Well, install -module DBA tools is the simplest command you could run to install DBA tools. You're gonna need probably PowerShell 4 and up, I wanna say. Just get 5.1 if you're upgrading. And my favorite way to install it is adding the scope current user command. Parameter and value. This basically says, instead of installing this for the whole system and putting this in program files and I need admin rights and blah, 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 why don't you just put it in my documents folder? It'll make a Windows PowerShell modules folder, drop DBA tools right in there, and then you can use the import module command, which we'll see in a little bit, and that will actually just set everything up for you. Now, we do support PowerShell v3, so we do have another option, which is getting it directly from our GitHub releases via this command. And this is just a one-liner you can paste right into your PowerShell console, invoke expression, invoke web requests, dbatools.io/in. And if you want, or if you're interested in what that actually does, you can just open up that address. It's pretty much aping exactly what install module is doing, just doing it in a version that doesn't have install module. So it's also, I don't believe it's getting it from the PS gallery, but neither here nor there. Either way, you should be ready to go with DBA tools. And then the next questions become, how do I use it? How do I learn more? How do I start having a good time? So that's where I want to get into briefly, just talking about the help. And there's a ton of help in PowerShell that's super useful. So DBA Tools has its own help commands, which we'll talk about, but get help, or just help, if you want to write it shorter in your shell, is super, super awesome. The documentation for PowerShell is way better than any scripting language I've ever used, to be honest. And you can even add additional flags. So this detailed flag, for instance, actually says, give me every single piece of information you have. You can use the examples flag and actually, if you're a lazy IT guy like me, get 3 or 4 useful examples saying this does that. And I got to be honest, when I read someone's documentation, sometimes there's questions in my mind or concerns or like, when I see it's actually being used to accomplish a goal, I have a clicking moment. My epiphanies go off, basically. So I highly recommend the examples command. And even better, if you do a -online, you will actually be directed to the DBA Tools documentation on our website. This is true for all the other PowerShell built-ins as well. It'll direct you to the new Microsoft Docs, which is awesome. If you were sad about the old PowerShell docs, they made you unhappy, the new docs on Microsoft is super slick, super nice. I'm gonna be honest though, the DBA Tools docs are better. This has things like full multimedia, sometimes even YouTube videos that are embedded in the page, but you can go and check out our DBA Tools YouTube channel. I think it's on the PowerShell VC, but I'll have to double check. And these are kind of the silent masterpieces of DBA Tools. They're usually demonstrating a single command. You get to watch it happen, you get to see how it works, and then you're done. We don't try to spend a bunch of time doing a presentation when we've got a bunch of them you can watch online. So that was a pretty fast help thing. We're gonna go over some help commands during the demo, but I also wanted to talk about if you get stuck. You know, DBA Tools is not 1.0 yet, and while it's fairly stable, there are bugs. There are things we need to fix and make better, and that's why DBA Tools is not 1.0 yet. One of the #1 commands that I've been using a lot recently, especially for people who are coming and saying, hey, I have this problem, is using a DBA tool command called get DBA Tools Log. And what that actually does is pulls from the central logging repository for DBA Tools on your computer. And so even if you're doing verbose information, or you're trying to, get details that aren't necessarily an error, oftentimes this command will actually reach in and pull out all sorts of useful details. So, I had a user come into our Slack channel last week and said, oh, I have this weird error, it says this thing. I did some troubleshooting, and of course, instead of just saying, hey, type get DBA Tools Log, which as soon as he did showed, oh, I have a remoting error. This has nothing to do with DBA tools, but maybe we could surface this error better for our user. So those kind of things are really useful to help you solve your own problem. The other two links are basically come to our Slack channel. We are extremely friendly, and a lot of people, some people get the impression that open source might mean yelling, swearing, personal negativity. Those are the things that we really don't do in the DBA Tools channel. We really value contributions, and we'd rather work with you to help understand your problem than say, oh, closed, designed this way or whatever. Sometimes that means we spend a little more time than we should, but it also generally means that people can come to us with their problems and we can make a better toolkit for the community. And that's what DBA Tools is about. Finally, if we do decide that there's a real issue or some problem we need to discuss beyond something that a straightforward chat would satisfy, filing a GitHub issue is really the best way to get a long-term or medium-term request in. And if you're not familiar with GitHub, or you're like, I don't want to deal with that stuff, you can either come in Slack, chat us, hit me up even on Twitter at MobileCK if you've got that. You can email me, Constantine at ConstantineKokkinos.com. I want to help you understand and work with those things. And if they're unfamiliar to you, it's a pretty straightforward process. Probably schedule an hour and we'll get you up to speed. Awesome. All right. One of the last slides before the demo is, oh, we're doing a PreCon. That's my best Chrissy simulation. She's super high energy. And you can see here our lovely people who are going to be joining us at the SQL Summit, as you were hearing in the intro. Head over to sqlps.io/precon and you can learn more. You can sign up. We'd love to see you. It's going to be 8 hours of awesome content. We're going to have a DBA Tools lab so you can take back these commands, run them in a safe environment, and make sure that you're not breaking anything before using them in production. So shout out to all my awesome people, major contributors to DBA Tools, and special shout out to Chrissy for making this all happen. Awesome. So I'm gonna switch over to the demo, and this is probably a good point to ask if we have any questions.
We do have one. Does the SMO library update very often? And how do you verify that the most current version is available?
That's a wonderful question. The answer used to be no. It used to be install the most recent version of SSMS, and you will have basically the most recent version of SMO. Microsoft has actually clearly separated those at this point. So honestly, what I do know is DBA Tools will generally have the most recent. So we have effectively a version parity. Like you'll have the 2016 SMO libraries, you'll have the 2014 SMO, et cetera. But honestly, I want to get back to you on how to make sure you have the most recent, because that's a useful question, and I know Chrissy's going to know the answer. Did you say that was the only question?
The other one is, who is the mayor of Acronym Town?
Ooh, that's good. It's not me. I'm honestly like a minor civil servant, but I'll definitely put in a requisition to figure out who. All right, let's get to the demo. It seems like a Zen Koan or something. Who is the mayor of Acronym Town? All right, so 2 seconds. All right, can you all see my demo?
Yes, sir.
Beautiful. All right, just making sure. So sorry if I'm not looking you in the face as much for the rest of this demo, because I've got this on a second screen. I'll try to adjust a little bit. But really the commands that I have in this demo are pretty straightforward. And I'm really focusing, if you've ever watched another DBA Tools demo, frankly, they're awesome. They have a bunch of cool stuff you can do with DBA Tools. I really want you to understand, walking away from this demo, what how you can find more information, how you can start to get at what commands you want to use. And frankly, when I was starting a year ago in PowerShell stuff, I did not understand about PowerShell help at all, and that was an epiphany. And really just getting deeper into some of the other pieces I'm going to show you right now. So let's dive in. First things first, a cool little trick Chrissy showed me, and I know she sourced it from someplace else. Putting a break at the top of your script in the ISE means if you hit play, you're not going to run everything in your script. So cool little demo tip. And I'm going to define a variable called SQL Server. It's very boring PowerShell. Everything has that $sign prefix. With a SQL Server we have in the DBA Tools Lab, which is one of the best perks of being a major contributor to DBA Tools. I am going to set some automatic variables. And if you're not a PowerShell expert, these are some really great variables you can mess around with. They're actually enums. But fundamentally what you can do is change the behavior of PowerShell based on if you get an error or not, or do you want to display additional verbosity messages? You know, if you're a Linux nerd, you might think -VVVVVVV or something like that. These are a little more human readable and they're universal. So advanced functions can actually see the state of your verbose preference and basically give you more information if that's set to say continue instead of silently continue. If you have more questions about that, which to be honest kind of threw me for a loop the first time, I highly recommend the About Redirection page. There's an online version of this too, and it actually breaks out, hey, do you want to talk about all your output, your success output, your errors, your warnings, verbose messages, debug messages, informational messages? These kind of things seem a little complex, but PowerShell has an amazing set of documentation about things that in many languages are not really spoken. They're just more things that you're supposed to know or read in a book somewhere that I've never read. So if you pipe about_star, probably even about star, PowerShell will list out all of the help files that describe metadata, like how do I learn more about continue instead of just the continue command? Or how do I learn about command precedence, which if you're trying to evaluate stuff, that's really important. Maybe debugging is interesting to you. And maybe environment variables to see what automatic things live inside of the PowerShell console. So I can't recommend enough to throw something into Get Help in the About stuff. And if you don't see all of these commands when you do an About, you're definitely going to want to run the update help command in an admin shell. Sometimes your PowerShell help can get a little bit behind, and it's all online resources that get pulled into some XML or something like that. Doesn't really matter, just matters that you should absolutely read some of this amazing help documentation, which is all available online as well. So using the native help, if I want to learn more about DBA tools, I can use my little wildcard DBA wildcard, and it will search for every command that I have available that has the letters DBA within it. And surprise, that's mostly DBA tools. In fact, on my system, that's only DBA tools. DBA tools actually uses the DBA prefix, even though it's in the middle, for all of its nouns. And PowerShell is super serious about the verb noun naming for public functions. So when you're actually looking for that, it's really a great limiter for DBA tool specific stuff. And you can then call out your specific help item, and we can say, oh, here's the name, test DBA SQL path, test if file or directory exists from the perspective of the SQL Server service account. If you've ever had to use XP command shell to do something like this, like I have, absolutely a useful thing. And we can see, oh, test DBA SQL path has an instance parameter that takes a DBA instance parameter type, has a path for a string, which makes sense for a file system. And then these brackets indicate optionally, it takes a SQL credential, which is a PS credential, and a silent. And then common parameters actually goes back to that advanced function where you can basically say, hey, when you have an error, do this thing specifically. It also breaks down some related links and some additional stuff. Hey, you can use detailed or example. Oh, okay, I will, because I am that lazy admin. And we can see, oh, here's 2 great examples. Test whether the service account running the SQL cluster instance can access this particular path. Logs into SQL cluster using Windows credentials. So awesome. And say I hate console-based help. I like reading it in my web browser. Well, if I just add that dash online, we can see the DBA Tools website loading up, and we can actually see, this is a little bit skint, but colorize commands, and we can jump even right to the source code on GitHub. Now, I like this a lot because I'm helping newbies, I'm trying to figure out what things do, but this is truly open source code. This is not, compiled into a binary that you then run. This is the exact code that is on your system, and as you can see, it's not that much going on. Connect to the instance. If there's a problem, stop it. Write a message. Set some SQL up. Write a message. Check if the file exists. If it doesn't work, stop it. Otherwise, if it does, return true. Otherwise, return false. So the code itself is actually not that complex, and in PowerShell is fairly readable because we don't do things like use aliases or use short names. And most of the PowerShell verb-noun combos are really straightforward at, oh, it says it does this thing. It probably does this thing. Now, in the DBA Tools project, we actually have our own help command, and that's for 2 main reasons. One, we love doing everything. No, one is it's fast, actually. The get help, once you start installing more and more modules on your computer as you're, oh, I love this PowerShell stuff. I have to get more pieces, more libraries to be able to do more things. Get help will slow down because get help actually has to enumerate drives. Sometimes those drives could be on a UNC path for some reason. So that kind of slowness makes people in the DBA Tools project cry. We love things that are fast. We run on database servers. Databases need to be fast. And so one of our major contributors, Simone, actually made this JSON file that kind of describes all of our commands. And it's the same exact file that's used on our dbatools.io website. If you go to the command section and you're searching, you're actually doing basically a web-based version of the same exact command. The only difference, of course, is on the web, you get a 1-click to the helpful documentation. On this one, you might have to do some piping or get some additional stuff. But honestly, I really like this a lot because if I'm working on a database, I'm maybe feeling like I can spend a little extra time experimenting. I can just throw in, oh, I want to look up network stuff. And dang, DBA Tools has a ton of stuff relating to networking. Interestingly, not all of these names have the word network in them. And that's because we actually tag the commands with metadata so that, oh, okay, well, connect DBA SQL Server. Yeah, that's going over a network. Copy DBA database though? Does that make sense? Well, actually, because it has network paths, it involves those types of network items. Copy DBA database needs to be network aware. And that's mostly true for the rest of these. But you can get deeper and see, oh, resolve DBA network name. Returns information about the network connection of the target computer, including NetBIOS, blah, 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 blah. So that's obviously a much more targeted name. And if we wanted to add some other filtering, we can see, okay, now we're getting much more specific BIOS commands. Okay, well, that's going to be not that many things because frankly, there's not many things you can do with the BIOS. And lastly, before I get into the things I use on the daily, I want to talk for a second about the command naming. I mentioned briefly PowerShell naming conventions and noun verb. Really, when I started using PowerShell, this rankled me. This got under my collar. I did not like, oh, anytime I import a module, PowerShell says I use an unapproved verb and it's, it complains basically. And I'm like, why are you complaining? I'm the programmer, I get to decide. But the truth is that in many cases, PowerShell functions are basically, especially in modules, are public functions. They're functions other people can use and should be using. And so when you use a name that is so random, it really hurts readability and it hurts knowledge transfer. And so in the last year of working on DBA Tools, I've really gotten that this verb-noun combo allows you to automatically know certain things like, oh, this get or test command probably not going to hurt anything or change state on this server. And there's a great command built into PowerShell where you can get the list of names it considers canonical or good, or basically that it won't complain about. If you can't find a verb that works with what you're trying to do in the DBA Tools project, come talk to me, because I guarantee you we can figure something out. So I just love that PowerShell exposes this kind of information in its own command, probably uses that command underneath the hood just to make sure that you fit within the get verbs. Awesome. All right, so last thing before I take a couple more questions, if you are not familiar with PowerShell, or you're wanting to contribute to DBA Tools, you're good at SQL or you're good at some aspect that you want to help with, the number one things I would take a look at from a basic standpoint is the select object, where object, and the format commands. And that's because you can get really, really, really far in PowerShell by assigning a variable, selecting and wearing your way to some data that you actually want. And unlike SQL Server, unlike any SQL really, and really some just set-based stuff, select and where in PowerShell have very specific idioms. You'll see more of them later in this demo. And those idioms can be a bit confusing at first. I certainly was confused on some of the formatting. PowerShell gets a little fancy with its brackets. So highly recommend reading both of those. And the get help format, there's a bunch of different ways you can actually output data in PowerShell. So the kind of default is a big list. And most of the DBA Tools commands that you run will give you, I kind of think of it as a JSON thing, like an encapsulated piece of information, really the object itself, and stream all those objects to you. With, say, format list, which is one of the options, number 3 there, you can actually say, hey, I don't really like looking at things in a bunch of lists. Can I get a table? I may be a DBA. I may be interested in tables. So format table is used extensively in this demo, and reading a little bit about how you can basically output to your various streams, back to our redirectors, and using the format commands will make your life so much easier when you want to manually inspect data instead of log it to a file or log it to another table or do something that an automated system would have. And all right, that's my second stopping point. So before I start on things I use on the daily, let's see if there's any other questions.
All right, we've got a few.
Excellent.
Is Azure Storage URL supported as a path in DBA Tools commands?
Not currently. We definitely want to support Azure, but it is really a huge kit and caboodle, and it's really separate from the on-prem in many, many, many ways. So as far as I know, it is planned, but I think it's a post 1.0 type of problem to solve.
Can we use both Windows and SQL credentials?
Yes, almost every single command that is going to log into your SQL server will actually have a SQL credential flag. And it's a little more complicated than just passing a credential in PowerShell. You have a get credential command, and then it will store it in a secure string. So you can basically get the credential, type in the SA password and username, and then every one of the commands that would need it are going to have a SQL credential. Windows creds are by default. So it assumes in almost every scenario that you're on a domain, you're connecting to your SQL server using a Windows user who's authenticated and oftentimes is SA. So that's kind of the default mode.
And then got a couple more.
Excellent.
What does package DBA tools cannot be installed because Authenticode is invalid? That may be an installation problem.
Yeah, try the scope current user. If that still has an issue, hit me up via one of the methods we talk about, because that's not something I've heard in our installation process, and I know that we're going to want to jump on it right away and get it solved for you.
And the last one is, can you please show me how to see the commands behind a DBA tools command?
Sure. I might need a little clarification. So we're just talking about, I think that's probably a question of, hey, I'm looking at a command, how do I see the code within it? Because we can certainly do that. That's, yeah. Well, yeah. So there's 2 ways I do this. And the first way is when you install DBA tools, it actually lives in a path. So yeah, I'll do the evil thing and type on a demo. All right, so get module will actually return information about your module. And if I'm not mistaken, we encapsulate that and ask for the path, we'll get our path. And I'm just going to copy paste this because I don't feel like using split stuff. So this is actually the DBA Tools module itself, the code behind it, and all of the functions that we're using live within the functions folder. So you can double click any command and there is all the code. We don't, like I said, we don't have any compiled resources that you're going to need to troubleshoot effectively. So that is what you have. The other big one is that online help. So if you go to dbatools.io, you get our lovely website I was talking about. And once that loads, there's a couple of ways that you can fairly easily go straight from the command index, searching for the commands. This is, of course, if you like the web-based help. And sorry, my VM's a little slow. Clicking any particular command, so copy DBA database in this case, will bring up the help. And at the very bottom of the help, we actually get the source code. So this is what is on GitHub at the moment, and these should be one and the same if you have the most recent version of DBA Tools. So you can see it online. You can even do fancy stuff if you're into Git and click the blame button and see who wrote those particular lines of code, and then be like, oh, God dang it, Chrissy, why'd you do that? So hopefully that answers your question. Any other interesting questions?
That is it. We are caught up.
Beautiful. All right, excellent. So yeah, to be honest, if you have any questions about getting, understanding, working with the code, just go to dbatools.io. That top right-hand corner has every single thing you're going to want. There's the find us there. You can get on our Slack right from there. You don't have to remember all these URLs I'm throwing at you. You can get source code. You can get YouTube videos. It is the one-stop shop for information. Awesome. So the next example I wanted to show to you is basically what I'll call my daily report. And various different people have various different needs for their environment. I spend a lot of time as an operational DBA, and that means making sure I don't have drift from certain blessed settings, making sure that other people with certain privileges aren't doing untoward things without me stopping them, because I can't. And so I want to walk you through a few commands from the DBA Tools project itself, instead of talking about the help and the metadata and all that stuff, and show you some cool things you can do with it. So honestly, the reason why I have this in DBA Tools instead of some proprietary SQL I wrote is because I don't have to maintain any of these. I don't have to really write these. And looking at this code, this has some extra stuff, but frankly, we're talking about 30 lines of code for everything that we're about to do here, which for me is really nice when you're talking about several thousand lines of SQL. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at our last backup date. And this is super important if you're a DBA or if your backups are failing. Hopefully you know this before you're running this command. But I like to be reassured anyway, you know, like the whole take a picture of your oven dials before you go on vacation. And here we can see that list format that I was talking about that is kind of default in PowerShell. So I'm probably scrolling a little too fast here. But we get SQL Server, we get the instance, we get the database, we get the last full and last log. And that sucks by default, to be honest. But it's what PowerShell is automatically doing. We just return the object. PowerShell decides, based on what type of output, how it's going to format it. And we can decide for it instead. So with the same command, get DBA last backup, we can actually pipe it, and that pipe is super important because what it says is take the objects on the left side of the pipe and send them to the right. And here's where I use the select object, and you'll notice there's a couple of things here. I pretty much get every single property, so I'm not limiting out here. Then I'm going to add sort object, which again, order by, basically, the last full backup. And lastly, I'm going to format it in a table form. So this is super nice in comparison to our list form because we get a lovely table formatted thing, frankly, very similar to what I would expect in a SQL query. We can see the nice ordering, my last full backup, so I can say, oh, 717, huh? That's probably not good enough for my environment. Thankfully, this is the DBA Tools test environment, so don't worry, no need to email my boss about it. So the next command I run is test DBA Job Owner. And when someone has access to the SQL agent, it's very easy to accidentally make jobs that are not owned by SA, or maybe not owned by your job runner if you have some special setup. So I can just pass it again, a SQL instance, and I don't necessarily even have to write that in this case, but when you have more than one parameter, it's a best practice. Login, compare it against the SA login, and again, I'm using a short term for format table. We get, oh, these are the jobs on your server that do not belong to SA and who currently owns them, which is mostly Chrissy and MS SSIS server cleanup job login. Owner match, false. And this, of course, would trigger me to go into my environment and say, okay, who set up this job? What is the correct settings for this? How do I solve that particular drift item? In many cases, you can actually solve that drift automatically. So our next command is test DBA database owner, which actually says, give me the login who you'd expect to own your databases. Again, SA is pretty common here. And I'm going to return the ones that don't. And this works multi-instances. If I did a for each loop or something like that, I could run 100 servers or 1,000. And because DBA Tools has such a focus on fast commands, I really don't have to worry about waiting a couple hours. This will probably take minutes or even less if you're talking about a large number of instances. And now I can say, okay, I don't really like that SA doesn't own these databases. If I wanted to, DBA Tools actually has a set DBA database owner command. So I can just report on it, I can know it, and at the same time, I can still just fix it and say, I don't really need to be involved with resetting the database owner unless, maybe I see it in my reporting for 2 days. Awesome. So we know our jobs are correct. We know our databases are owned by the right people. Now let's make sure our virtual log files are valid. Now, if you're not familiar with VLFs or virtual log files, they're basically a performance and recovery concern. If you're not a SQL expert, it's basically like a log chunk, if you will. It's distributed and it has to be restored in those same amount of chunks. So anytime you get over, say, 200 VLFs, depending on your size of your logs and your environment, I start to say, okay, how do we responsibly grow this log out so that we don't have this very stratified VLF system? That also has to do with how large your log growth is, et cetera. Generally, you want to pre-grow your logs if you can by decent increments so that you're looking at a small amount of VLFs. And I do know that some people in the DBA Tools project have found, 200,000, someone even said 2 million at some point. So checking these is useful, and with this command is super straightforward. Now, I've added 2 things to the basic command here, and that is a where clause. So in PowerShell, your wheres generally want to live within a script block, which is this little curly Q braces. And the $_ is pretty much the current item in the pipeline. So where each item's count is greater than 50. Lastly, I send it to this really slick command, works only on Windows right now, called OutGridView. And OutGridView will actually give you what I would say is what SSMS's output should have been, which is a sortable, filterable, so greater than or equal to result set. And if you're wanting to play with data or you're debugging and you want to see what an object looks like, I really like OutGridView because it's really quick to manipulate. Especially if you have more columns, it's super fast. It can take tens of thousands of rows without choking most of the time, unless you have some very interesting data. And it also has a pass-through parameter. So you can actually add that to OutGridView, have another thing in your pipeline, and then your manual selections will actually have an OK button in your lower right. So PowerShell is smart enough to actually say, get a database, send it to OutGridView, select it in OutGridView, hit OK, and maybe I'll pass that to back up the database. So you can kind of build a very rudimentary GUI and have some human interaction. Or I often do this when I'm first starting to write a command. I like to add like a check of the debug preference or the debug mode, and basically, hey, if I'm debugging right now, output this object to OutGridView. And that way I can get a quick insight into what's going on without having to do a bunch of extra output. So I love OutGridView a lot. You should use it. It's awesome. All right. So the next little example, I'm going to build up a bit. So we're going to use the same command, but we're going to actually do a couple different things so we can talk about how would you log this information to a table. So by default, I run this get DBA database as well. And mostly I run this command because it has a lovely little size column. It says basically, hey, how much space am I currently using? And this is a really basic command, but I will take that, exclude the system databases, and get a list of how big are my databases, right? This is my total space. This is really nice at a glance if I'm going on vacation or something like that, and I want to make sure that I've got what I expect. But you can also use this for very basic trend analysis really quickly. And DBA Tools facilitates that in a way that I really, really love. So in this case, I've broken this up a little bit so we can understand it better. You can actually even write this all as one line, though it runs a little bit slower when you pipe between the objects. So first, we're going to run the same command we just ran, but we're going to assign it to the databases variable here. Cool. So yep, we get no output, which is exactly what we would expect. It's now assigned as databases. So if we wanted to, we can just write databases, and we should see the output we expect. Awesome. Now, here is one of the real magical pieces of DBA Tools, and it's not so much for your operations need, but more for using DBA Tools as the glue between SQL and really anything else. And that is to say, out DBA Data Table, and for the input, use the database value. So we're going to create a data table, and if you're not familiar with data tables, they are a .NET type. So if you're SQL 100% of the time, you've got your nvarchar, you've got, well, really character data, numeric, imprecise, precise, etc., XML, sadness. With a data table, this is actually a .NET type, and this basically is a type specifically that SQL Server really likes, has a lot of abilities to easily consume and produce data tables. And so we actually have command to produce a data table from your arbitrary value, and then write that data table. So we're going to do that real quick. Now I've used a couple other options here. Write DBA data table takes the SQL Server like all our other commands. I'm going to write it to our temp DB because I don't really care about this table in real life. I'm going to write the data table I created. I'm going to call that table data size. And only for this demo, I'm going to pass it the auto create table parameter. So if you've ever done auto creation of tables, you'll know it's not always perfect, and DBA Tools actually works pretty hard to say, okay, we've got this data table of values. What is a sane SQL schema for this, or organization? But not always perfect, so just keep that in mind. You may want to go back and actually update that table, alter it to make it better, or just create a table with the same organization as the data you're outputting. And we can see I wrote a little one-liner to query because I don't have SSMS on this machine because I don't need it. Here is the query of the data sizes for this particular gathering. Now, obviously, if we are going to do real reporting, we're going to need to add dates, or we're going to need to add some other metadata so we can say, this is the row, this is, etc. But super straightforward to say I have arbitrary data I want to get from one of the DBA Tools commands, or literally anything, convert it into a data table and then write that data table to SQL Server, and now you're data pumping with 5 lines of code. So one of my favorite things to do with DBA tools when I'm just figuring out what's the next stage of this monitoring and reporting that I'm going to do. All right, so this is really the next good breaking point. Are there any other questions we wanted to address?
There is one question that you didn't answer in the demo. Is there a way to email OutGridView?
Ooh, that's a really good idea. I probably wouldn't email OutGridView itself as much as I would either select the objects I wanted to email or send that table right to something that could do an email. But, I can't help but ask. The PowerShell, because it knows. I'm figuring email and SMTP are 2 good keywords. Ooh, sends an email message. I might look into more on send mail message and see if you can pipe the DBA tools output directly to that, and maybe skip a whole process of annoying setup of SMTP servers.
And we've got one more. Can the output of DBA tools commands be exported to something like a CSV file?
Absolutely. So I talked about the format commands. There's also a out dash commands and the convert commands. So if you're in PowerShell and you wanted to, say, get something into CSV, just throw that help $CSV, and you'll notice convert from CSV, convert to CSV, export CSV. So the converts are more for the types and the exports are more for writing files, basically. But you can absolutely take any PowerShell script, take the object output, convert it to a CSV object, write it as a CSV file, and then do whatever the heck you want with it. So that's totally normal and correct. And you can do that with log files. You instead of having this output always going to my screen, most of the time you want to write PowerShell to do as much as possible without your intervention. If you're running these things manually every day, you're doing it wrong. Reality-wise, you should be scheduling stuff to do this. You should be building a script that runs this for you. Line by line running of PowerShell is basically just going back to the Stone Age of doing it all via hacking it in SQL, but without the agent. So highly recommend you decide what formats you want, and PowerShell does XML, it does JSON, it does CSV, it does plain text. It even has its own XML-based serialization format, so not necessarily recommended as a general rule, but you can write your object to a file and later pull that file in and pull it in as a PowerShell object. So there's some really cool stuff you can do with serialization in PowerShell.
That's awesome. We are caught up.
Okay, great. So I'm actually going a little bit faster than I thought. So I have a couple of commands here to basically run, and I run these whenever someone hands me a new server and I'm not certain that it's really configured in the way I would. And these are honestly based on things I've experienced in the past. So you may want to take a look at some of the other test commands, because the test commands in DBA tools basically give you all of the best practices and tell you when you're violating them. And DBA tools, okay, we've got some major contributors, whatever, but I would say almost every single one of our test commands is actually based on some, huge blogger everyone knows, their work then codified into a PowerShell command. And, we've worked with all sorts of different people. You should check out our front page. There's some great titans of SQL there, because we don't think we have all the answers. That's the open source kind of, again, mantra of like, I know everything. That's not true. And I would much rather take someone who has that SQL knowledge or has that hardware knowledge. I worked with DBA Job on one of the commands I'll show you, because he was the one who could easily break down, oh, this is how all the allocation units work in NTFS under these conditions in virtual machines. And I'm just like, but I don't have to remember it. We wrote a command, now I can test, and boom, I'll know if I did it right or not, and it will tell me what I need to do in many cases. So let's start talking about testing things. So not the most amazing commands, but ones I really love. Test DBA max stop. So if you've ever had a conversation about max stop, oh, no, it isn't. Not crazy. Yeah, all right, I'm just gonna move on to the next one.
I think it's supposed to be SQL Server.
It should generally, that's why. Should generally be a SQL instance. I just tested this guy. Oh, life of the demo. Let's try this again. All right. Interesting. Let's try the next one.
Yeah, your variable name should be SQL Server, CK.
Oh, gosh, yeah, sorry. That's what it was. Thank you. Totally blinded. You're the best. All right.
Chrissy for the win.
Oh, Chrissy, I love you. Literally, she's the best. Don't change your demos at the last minute, everyone. Now you know why. Yeah, because it was definitely talking about my parameter. Awesome. All right. So without further ado, test DBA max stop. And this is actually super cool because this is one of those instances of SMO magic and PowerShell working together really, really well. So the reason I had it as server was I was going to show you that, and I'm still going to. So we can see here a whole bunch of instances and specifically databases. And if you haven't worked in SQL Server 2016 yet, you might not know that databases can have their own max stop settings. So on 2016, this actually returns the max stop for your databases. On 2014 and earlier, I'm going to test my luck here. We actually get a max stop of just the server level. So I really love this command because it really shows, oh, things change. And in many cases in SQL Server, they change for the better. DBA Tools handles that. We're not just going to return the information that works on 2014 and 2016. We're really going to return the useful information to you that you need to know. Because if your max stop on one of your databases is different than what you would expect, that's not going to be the same as the server level instance setting. So absolutely a lovely command that I will immediately check. And you can actually see on the right, it's a little hidden there, but recommended max stop is based off the Microsoft recommendation on number of cores, on your NUMA settings. So it really is just saying, hey, you know, you do what you want, but here's maybe the best way you could do it, or at least the best practices way. Test DBA max memory, also a super nice one, because this is actually multi-instance aware. So you can see there, instance count 3. So it's actually going to give you a recommendation based on the fact that you're doing instance stacking, which for me is a pain in the butt. I just hate having to figure out, oh wait, well, this server, you know, obviously, and this is not perfect, it is a recommendation, but it is based on the same recommendations that you would find in the best resources on the internet. So of course, you make the change, you're gonna need to do some additional monitoring, but this will actually give you a baseline to start from without having to argue. And that's honestly always been a point of contention with DBAs is, at least for me, hey, how do we do this? Why are we doing it? Who said so, right? And I would rather update a command in the DBA Tools project to match the current best practices than pretend like we know what we're talking about, frankly. We are here to facilitate those things, not necessarily, you know, do I have the knowledge about hyper-converged infrastructure? I'm gonna go talk to David Klee about that. Or PowerShell, I'm gonna go talk to Chrissy about that. All right, test DBA SPN is one of the network things I'm gonna check because again, someone probably screwed this up. I hate SPNs. I hate everything to do with SPNs before working with PowerShell and DBA tools, because Drew at Pittsburgh on Twitter wrote these amazing test and set DBA SPN commands. And oh my God, they are like 100 times faster than the Microsoft Kerberos tool, which was literally the only lifeline that you had when you were working with SPNs besides really dense documentation. So when we run it, we can actually get back fairly quickly based on our network. This would take minutes in the Kerberos manager. Here's all the instances. Here's their SPNs. Are they set? And is there any problem? So in fact, 2 of these stacked instances on this machine do not have the SPN set up in the way that we would expect. So I could pass that to set SPN. I could maybe take some other actions, but I'm not going to change the lab environment right now. So that would be more of an investigative thing. And frankly, in my environment, I can't set SPNs. I need to get my IT involved. So I need to go talk to them. Another really useful command is testing your DBA connection auth scheme. You could, of course, go and query in SSMS, but again, if you have 200 servers, you can just put the list in there for each. Tell me if it's NTLM, because obviously it should not be in most cases. A super annoying thing and just like minor, but when you go to the DBA Tools project, you get all these built-in answers, and I can just find DBA command, put in network, and test DBA connection auth scheme will come up, and I can start using that right away. So these commands are basically all things that I would have expected my SAN admin or my VM admin or really who's ever in charge of the systems to set up properly, and oftentimes are an afterthought if maybe this wasn't supposed to be a SQL server at first, or maybe something else, or maybe just someone had a long day. So test DBA disk alignment actually comes back and says, did you set up your disks in such a way that basically you're affected by an issue that really should have been solved since like 2008? But going into what's your offset calculations for each partition, and then if you actually set these up properly, you can see, all true. We're super happy about that. And that's also because these are virtual disks and don't have the same qualification. Test DBA disk allocation. Is this a SQL disk? And is it best practice to put your SQL disks on your C drive? Heck no, absolutely not. And this would, of course, I would be taking immediate action. So a nice little is best practice flag shows up. And in many of these test commands, if you're just filtering where is best practice equals false, you're getting back all of your action items for the day or the week or the year in some cases. And this one I super love because I actually did some bug fixing on it. Test DBA power plan. I was very upset at finding out how many servers in my environment did not have the high performance power plan set. And if you don't have this, your processor may just downclock in the middle of doing stuff. So you definitely want to make sure your DBA power plan is set to high performance. And actually, this was a fun one because we had some German users, DBA Tools is an international project, come to us and say, hey, this doesn't work. Why isn't this working? Of course, German error messages, I don't read German. The actual problem was high performance in German is, of course, not the words high performance. And so we had to internationalize test DBA power plan to check for the high performance GUID that you have available. It doesn't really matter that much, but it was a great example of, hey, you write code, you think it's awesome, and then it completely breaks out in the real world. And it's really why DBA Tools works, is we don't have isolated environments where the code is run in our perfectly clean place. It's, hey, did you ever expect someone to run it in the German language? No? Well, write better code. And that's what we're doing as a result. And then my last command I have here in my check if things are silly on my new server is testing the collation. Basically, if your database collation clashes with your server collation, you're gonna have a bad time, especially if it's tempdb clash. There's all sorts of docs you can read on that. It's very simple to miss. And I think that's the other things is oftentimes DBAs have big checklists because you simply cannot remember every single thing that you need to do unless you've been doing in the biz for 25 years. So being able to take these giant pieces of code and shrink them down into, okay, I have 8 commands I need to run, and those commands will be maintained by other people. And if I ever want to get an update, I just need to update module DBA tools, is just the biggest wins for me in my environment. And so I hope that that sounds interesting to you. For my final slide, which Chrissy never gets to in any of our presentations, I just want to say, DBA Tools community got us feeling like everything is awesome. I've spent the last year working on this project. I really have enjoyed every minute of it. And frankly, I really would love you to join our Slack channel, give us a shout out, tell us what we did wrong, tell us what we did right, whatever. We'd love to hear from you. So thank you very much. My name is Constantine Kokkinos again, and that's my presentation. Any other questions? I'd be glad to handle.
This is awesome. Thank you, Constantine. We have one more question. Does Test DBA Test DBA Power Plan check only the Windows Power Plan, or is it able to look at the BIOS power settings?
That's a great question. I believe it only looks at the Windows Power Plan. So if you're actually setting the BIOS incorrectly, heaven help you. But actually, that's something I'm just going to write down to double check, because Chrissy could probably answer that in 1 second. But off the top of my head, check BIOS Power Plan. I don't know that it's doing it. I feel like WMI/sim can do that. So if we're not already doing it, we absolutely should.
And Chrissy just answered, it is just Windows, but that's a great idea to check.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad she's here.
That's awesome. Tell us one more time how people can keep up with the project and if they want to contribute.
Absolutely. 1 second, let me get that slide. So I think the best slide to leave up is dbatools.io/Slack. That's the place where we spend most of our communication hours. And if you have additional questions beyond that, DBA Tools.io, find us in the top right-hand corner, has a great, I'll just pull that up, great little set of information that you can break out. So we've got a nice find us, and there's our Slack, our GitHub, our Twitter, our YouTube, or even our LinkedIn, which I didn't mention. But if you actually become a major contributor, join up on our LinkedIn group and basically show that on your resume to future employers.
That's awesome. Thank you very much once again. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. We'll get the slide deck and the video recording up as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Awesome. And have a wonderful day.
Keep an eye on your emails. We're going to pick a winner, and we'll email the lucky recipient of the $100 gift card sometime later today. Thanks, everybody. Thank you again, Constantine.
Sounds great. Have a great day.